Hi, everyone from around the country, and thank you very much for coming to today's seminar. Firstly, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Thankfully, Johannes has agreed to give this seminar today. The topic is around forgetting and how we forget things. Johannes is being hosted by Juliana at University of Sydney at the moment. And I'm now going to hand over to Juliana to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. It's my great pleasure to have Johannes here, so visiting us at the University of Sydney and the Life Course Center broadly. Johannes is a behavioral economist, development economist, neuroeconomist, perhaps other things that I'm missing. He has done a lot of research on poverty, in particular in the context of developing countries, but not only. He has published in many top economic journals, but also in journals from other fields. So he's really working multidisciplinarily. And I'm very happy that you made the trip to Australia to visit us first time. That's my understanding. And I look a lot forward to your talk. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here. What an amazing city. We've had a little bit of a chance to see it. It's been spectacular already, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the 2 days that I'm going to spend with you. When we discussed about what I would present, I proposed this talk and was asked, well, does this have anything to do with poverty? And that was actually an easy question to answer, because although the title sounds like a straight up behavioral economics paper, which I think it is at this point, the motivation originally that drove me in this direction was one that was motivated by development economics questions, namely, why is take-up of productive technology so low in many low-income settings? So development economists, as people in this room know, have had a hell of a time getting people to buy fertilizer or get their children vaccinated and so on. And I think one possibly overlooked explanation for such failures is that people just forget to do it. They're very busy and trying to take care of 100 things, and then something falls off the radar and they end up not following through on it. And it then occurred to me that we haven't really taken a systematic step at studying forgetting. And so that's what this paper is trying to do. And you'll see that it's because it's at least my first foray into this area. It's the very bare bones, basic stuff, kind of trying to do the janitorial work on understanding how this works over the course of days and weeks. So that's the project. It's my first ever and only single-authored paper. So to the RAs in the room, don't write single-authored papers. It's not fun. You're much more productive when you do it with friends. The episode that finally got me to follow through on starting this project is the following. And this is also a very old project. So in 2011, I moved from Switzerland to the US for a postdoc. And right around the same time, my friend Molly Crockett, who many of you will know, now this has stopped working. Oh, there it is. It's just delayed. Maybe I have to point it better or something. Do I have to be? I can. Okay, let me try the swiping. 1 second.
Here we go.
No.
Good. Click now. Click now.
Okay. Yes. Okay. This is Molly Crockett, whom the neuro folks amongst you will know. She's a psychologist, neuroscientist now at Princeton. But at the time, she moved from the US to Switzerland. So we were exchanging places, and we thought this is a great opportunity to save some money exchange fees. So I gave her a bunch of Swiss francs that I had left, and she gave me a check. So this is the check. But at the time, Europe hasn't operated on checks for I don't know how many centuries. The US still does. And so I didn't have an opportunity to cash this thing right when I received it. Instead, I had to wait a couple of months. from like June to October or whatever, I actually moved to the US and had a bank account. And of course, you can anticipate what happened. I didn't remember to cash this check. And 3 years later, when I moved out of my office to start my faculty job, I found this check under a pile of papers. Now, it turns out the checks expire. You have about 6 months or so to cash it. So what then ensued was a whole slew of emails. This is the email saga that then ensued. We did finally manage to get me this money, but it was costly to do this. And so the fact that I didn't have an opportunity to act on this check immediately, I was forced to delay it, led me to forget about it, and that created some costs. And so that's the original motivation, the thing that finally got me to act on this project idea. So I'm not the first, of course, to study memory. There's a long tradition in psychology, mainly on retrospective memory. So things that you've learned in the past that you're trying to remember today. And this goes back to the very early days of experimental psychology. So Hermann Ebbinghaus, who is one of the founding fathers in Germany in the 1880s of experimental psychology, did a famous series of self-experiments where he created all the 3-letter syllables that the German alphabet allowed and memorized them in sets of 13 or so. It's a very painstaking study, and then tested himself on the recall of these syllables and drew out the function that described his own remembering. So the way that he did this is he relearned to the same criterion at different intervals, and the share of the original time that it took him to relearn, he interpreted as the share that he had forgotten over that time period. So if he had to spend the exact amount of time relearning as he spent originally learning, he said, I forgot 100%. And so he wrote down how much he recalled after X hours. This is up to 31 days. And then this is the share that he remembered. So from 60% to 21% or so. This kind of task, remembering things that you've seen in the past, is very standard in psychology. It's made it into standard inventory. So for example, the Montreal Neurological Inventory has a word recall task that rose to fame when Donald Trump had to perform it. And do you remember this episode where he said in an interview that he had to remember person, woman, man, camera, TV, and he did tremendously by his own account. So this is a very standard task, but what I'm interested in is not retrospective memory, but prospective memory. And the crucial difference is that in prospective memory, you're trying to remember to do something in the future at a specific point in time. So you need to remember, it needs to occur to you right at the correct moment in time. And there's 2 kinds that psychologists distinguish. The first is event-based, where you have to recall the action based on when a particular event occurs. So for example, you need to refill a prescription when it runs out, or when your kid turns 1 and you're living in a context where you don't automatically get reminded, you need to remember to get them vaccinated. And then there's time-based prospective memory, where you need to remember it at the right time. So for example, by April 15, you need to file your taxes, or many of you might be familiar with mail-in rebates. You buy a printer for $50 more than it's supposed to cost, and you're supposed to send in a postcard a couple of weeks later. And the follow-through rates on these things are famously low, in the single digits. You need to vaccinate your child, or this is another developing setting example, when you fetch water at the water source, you don't have an opportunity to chlorinate it right then and there. You need to walk home first, and half an hour later, you reach the home, and you've forgotten at that point that you need. And so you don't do it. So that's prospective memory, and that's what I'm interested in studying. Let me briefly summarize what people have done on this before. There's a bunch of work in psychology, but it's mostly in the lab, and it's over the course of seconds and minutes. And I'll tell you why I think that is in the second study of the talk. There's one study that deviates from that, which is the very original study by Meacham and Singer, who asked subjects to return postcards on specified days over the course of 5 weeks. But they're not really interested in the shape of the function. They just show that people forget, and that they can get them to not forget by increasing the incentives. And then there have been a couple of great economics papers, including recently. So Keith Erickson has a nice paper from 2011. But like all the other economics papers, he's mainly interested in whether people are over-optimistic about their likelihood of following through. So he shows that when you tell people to send a request for payment 6 months in the future, only about half of participants remember to do this. But when you elicit their willingness to pay for a reminder, that willingness to pay implies a much higher perceived probability of following through, about 76%. So people are over-optimistic in their beliefs about whether they're going to follow through. Similar results in other studies that came much later. There's a very recent paper in Econometrica by Aaron Bronchetti and others who extend this to multiple dates and payoffs, and again find strong over-optimism. And I'll modify these findings somewhat in the third study that I'll show you. But to take a step back, what I'm interested in is a much more basic question, and that's why I used the word janitorial work in the beginning. I just want to understand what the shape of that function is. So Ebbinghaus showed in the 1880s that retrospective memory follows a power function. It decays with a power function. And the first question that I'm interested in, which isn't really of a development economics relevant one, it's just the one that I really want to know the answer to, is I just want to know what the shape of that function is. So is it an exponential, or is it also a power function? Is it a hyperbola? It has some implications what that shape is. So for example, if it is a decreasing rate over time, then that predicts that you would be present biased in intertemporal choice if you have to act on the payment. So often intertemporal choice tasks have vouchers that you need to cash. So there are some predictions that are practical in nature, but really, quite honestly, I just want to understand the shape of that function. Secondly, I want to know how remembering varies with stake size. So are people more motivated by large rewards? That's going to be the subject of the first study. In the second study, I want to understand what's the natural rate of remembering. And to ask that question is because the existing tasks, including my own first task, confound remembering probability with the endogenous use of reminders. So the reason I think psychologists study this in the lab over minutes and seconds is because you can control the use of reminders. I'm interested in a setting where people have to remember over days and weeks, because that's much more relevant for real life. But in that setting, you have to worry about whether people just put a reminder in their phone. And so in the second study, I'll try to get around that. And I'll show you how I try to solve that problem. And then finally, I want to understand the subjective rate of remembering. So this is going back to those economics papers that I showed you. I'm going to put another data point on that graph and study what people believe about their likelihood of remembering. If that's lower than the actual rate, that has interesting implications. People will fail to follow through on plans that they can make. Firms can exploit this, as in the case of mail-in rebates. Okay, so I'll show you 3 studies on this topic that were all done at the Busara Center in Kenya. Busara is a lab for behavioral economics that I set up over 10 years ago now. It's a public good, so if you ever have a behavioral experiment to run in Kenya, you can use this resource. It's a nonprofit, so they just charge you what it costs them to run the study. The first study asks simply, what's the rate of remembering as a function of delay and stake size? The second study tries to estimate the natural rate when you don't use endogenous reminders. So in the first study, you're free to do whatever you want with reminders, put it in your phone. In the second study, I try to get around that, and I'll show you how. And then the third study, we're interested in the subjective rate of remembering. Okay, so this is the team that helped me run the study. It was a large undertaking with over 3,000 participants and several weeks and several contact points for each participant. So I'm very grateful to this team for making this study possible. All right, let me talk about the first study. Here, I'm simply interested in understanding what's the likelihood that people follow through when I tell them to do a particular task at a certain point in the future for a given reward. The basic idea is that we're going to ask them to contact Busara after a specified delay, and that delay ranges from now to later today to tomorrow to between 1 and 5 weeks in the future after that initial date. in order to receive a reward that ranges from 500 to 1,500 shillings, you can think of this roughly as 100 to 1 for US dollars. It's slightly less now, but for all intents and purposes, think of this as 5, 10, and 15 US dollars. We'll control for the present value of the reward by paying all the rewards at the end of the study. So this is something that I think previous studies have gotten wrong. Well, wrong from the point of view of understanding the shape of the function, not wrong from the point of view of over-optimism. But if you want to understand the shape of the function, I think you need to hold motivation constant to remember to do that, or to even invest in remembering this. And so in order for that to be the case, the payment needs to have the same present value. And I achieved that by simply paying everything at the very end. So at the end of 5 weeks, you get the payment. And I try to distinguish prospective memory per se from just forgetting the instructions by providing the same instructions either later or immediately. So you're always aware of what you're supposed to do, which number you're supposed to contact, and so on. The difference is simply in when you get told what you're supposed to do. And I hold transaction costs constant by asking people to complete a task in both the experimental and the control condition. So the crucial comparison is going to be between a condition where people don't get reminded to perform the task and one where they get reminders on the day. And that also allows me to distinguish forgetting from technical failure. So if you have your phone off, for example, that would be controlled for by this approach. Okay, so here's how this works. Here's a timeline. People are first called on the phone. This all happens on the phone. People are called on the phone to be recruited into the study. And then they get a first payment of 1,000 shillings, so about $10. And that's simply to establish trust and test the functionality of the mobile money system M-Pesa, which is how they're going to receive the money. Almost everybody in Kenya uses this mobile money system. And then in the main call, they get told to contact Busara at a specific date in the future. This is a between subjects assigned. So each person is told, if you want to earn a certain amount of money, you can contact us exactly 2 weeks from now, for example, and then we'll pay you 5 weeks from now that amount of money. So for example, you might be told to contact Busara immediately after the initial call, and then you get 1,500 5 weeks later. Or you could be asked to contact Busara tomorrow, and so on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And then the amount, like I mentioned, varies between 500, 1,000, and 1,500 shillings. And like I said, this is across subjects. So each participant is in one of 24 conditions, 8 delays by 3 amounts. Then, right, the main call happens in the morning, so between 7 in the morning and 11. And the contact call has to happen exactly on the right date in the future, between 12 and 5 p.m. in the afternoon. By the way, if you have clarifying questions along the way, I'm totally happy to take that. I don't know if it's against protocol, but I'd much rather you speak up if you don't understand. Okay, so then in addition to these 24 conditions, we're multiplying those by 2 again, hence the large number of subjects. The reminder and the no reminder condition. So in the no reminder condition, people get the instructions immediately after that first call, which means that by the time they need to do the task, they're not reminded. They can look up the instructions in their phone, but they don't get an additional reminder. The reason to send them the instructions, obviously, is that failures to follow through aren't failures of forgetting the phone number or forgetting what exactly to do. You know exactly what to do. You can look. And in the reminder condition, people get reminders every hour on the hour during the window from 12 to 5 when they're supposed to. So in addition to that, they get hourly phone calls during this window. So we're really trying hard to help people remember to do this. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that when they're failing, they're not failing because they have their phone off or they're out of reception, something like that. Okay, so like I mentioned, this is done at Busara in Nairobi. This was in 2017, 1,300 participants. The pool is relatively low income, so people earn on average about $2.40 a day. Average age is 33. About half, a little over half of the sample are female. Most of them have completed primary school. About half of them have completed secondary school. And this is a picture of M-Pesa, which is the mobile money system that we use to make the payments. Yeah. The recruitment happens through the Busara's participant pool, which is a group of about 60,000 people from the Nairobi and.
So they already, some of them have already participated in the past.
Yeah, that's right. And that's that's a feature here rather than a bug, because they trust us. They trust that we're actually going to send them the money in the future when we tell them to. Okay, so let me jump straight to the results. These are the contact rates by time and amount for the different reward conditions. So 500 shilling reward is on the left, 1,000 shillings and 1,500 shillings. The solid lines are the no reminder conditions, so you just have to remember to do it at the right time. The dotted lines are the reminder conditions. This is the condition where you really get hit over the head, with reminders during that window when you have to make contact. And first thing to notice is that the reminders really do work. These are, in many cases, indistinguishable from one. So people manage to do this task when we tell them on the day, remember you had to send this text message today. Oh, sorry, I didn't even tell you how they need to contact us. They need to send us either a text message or make a phone call or send us what's called a call me request. It's free of charge to send that. It's like paging someone. And so that also rules out that people don't do it because they're constrained somehow. The second thing to notice is that it falls off relatively steeply after the first day or so when you don't get reminders. So people are not great at following through. For 500 shillings, this goes down to about half after 5 weeks, and somewhat less for the larger amounts, but it drops off relatively steeply. So to put some numbers on this, a 500 shilling reward, which corresponds to about 1.5 times your daily income, is forgotten with 19% probability after 1 day and 52% after 2 weeks, after 5 weeks. 1,500 shilling reward, which is now over 4 times your daily income, is forgotten with 4% probability after 1 day and 25% probability after 5 weeks. This also means that the economic costs of forgetting are high. So if you ask someone to remember something for even just a day, that costs them between 17 and 26% of their average daily income. If you ask them to remember for 5 weeks, that's between 72 and 72% in one whole daily income. And you'll also see that the rate of forgetting is especially high in the beginning. So you see this drop here is relatively steep, and then it kind of stays flat. So for 500 shillings, of the entire drop that happens over the course of 5 weeks, 37% of that drop happens between days 1 and 2. And fully half of that drop happens in the first week. And similarly, for 1,500 shillings, 16% of the drop happens in the first 2 days, and almost the entire drop, 92% in the first week. So it's relatively rapid after that initial period of a day. So I told you that I'm interested in understanding what the shape of that function is. So yeah, question.
Do you have an idea of what are the methods they use for remember, if they do any? Because I don't know about these phones, how easy it is to put a reminder on them, or whether they use like, how does that fit into their daily schedule? Because of course, if you have an office job, which is probably not the case, then you see a reminder and then you just do it and that's it.
Yeah.
But if you're working on the field,
yeah. So that's a great question. So I think there's 2 questions in here. One is what strategies do people use? And the answer is about half of people, when you ask them, use some strategy to remember, some reminder strategy. And that again breaks down into, I forget the exact shares, but a good number use their phones. So even these simple feature phones, you can set reminders. Not everybody knows how to do it. But then the other half or so either use a piece of paper or friends. So those are the prominent strategies that people use. That's the answer to the first question. The answer to the second question is that it could very well be that people are in a setting where they can't easily follow through, like they're working in the field, like you said, or they're out of town or something like that. That's precisely the reason we had this control task. The fact that during that window, when they're supposed to do the task, we can reach basically everyone. And they're able to do the task in that window. Tells us that, it's not, they could be distracted. That's kind of what we're trying to measure. But they're not unavailable. It's not, technical failures. We can reach them. Yeah.
So this forgetting, is it because they intend to remember and they cannot? Or is it because I was told that to call back in 5 weeks and I realized that, okay, this is, I don't think I'm gonna
Right.
do that. You asked that question at the beginning. Do you plan to call back? Right?
Yeah.
But that's a, I will say that, yeah. Is it possible that, okay, I will call back, but I don't even intend.
You don't take it seriously.
So can we differentiate these two?
That's really hard. We tried to do it. As you say, we framed it as a yes-no question with precisely this in mind, right? Maybe people hear this task and they're like, oh, forget about it. We do ask them that question not once, but 3 times to really give them an opportunity to tell us, actually, no, forget about it. I'm not going to do it. And on all 3 occasions, the response, the yeses are 100%. So everybody tells us that they really want to do this, which is not shocking because these are very large payoffs in the context in which people live. But we can't fully rule out, right, that they tell us, okay, fine, I'll do this, but secretly they don't have any intention to. The fact that when we then call them back and say, like in the reminder condition, we call them back and say, hey, remember you want to say, can you please do that now? They do it, suggests that they have some motivation to do it. Like it's not that they resent that small task so much that they're never going to perform it. But I think, I don't think it's observable ultimately whether deep in their hearts people didn't want to. We try to get as close as we can. Okay. Right, so I told you I wanted to understand what the shape of that function is. And so we fit a number of the prominent functions that people in the psychology literature have used to describe retrospective memory. So this is, most of these are taken from a famous paper by Wickstead from UCSD from the 1990s. And what I'm showing you here are the Bayesian information criteria. So lower values are better fits. And the power function is the one that overall has the best fit. Some of the differences are not huge, but it comes through as the best fitting function. This is the power function. T is time, and there's 2 parameters that govern the shape. And so this is nice because this is exactly the function that Ebbinghaus discovered in the 1880s for prospective memory. So it was very gratifying to see this pop out. Okay, so that was the answer to my nerdy question, what's the shape of the function? It's very well described by a power function or by close relatives like exponential power. So let me summarize this first study. People forget relatively quickly over time, especially in the beginning. Power function is a good fit for the data. Large amounts are less likely to be forgotten. I didn't show you the statistics on that, but you saw it in the graphs. What I also didn't show you is that it's mostly uncorrelated with demographics. So age, gender, education, income doesn't really correlate, except present bias. So I measure present bias and time preference, and present bias people are more likely to forget. And like I mentioned in answer to the question, about half of people use endogenous reminders, but that doesn't correlate with remembering. Okay, any questions about that first study? Okay, then let me see how much time I have. Okay, we're actually not much time. Okay, so let me quickly tell you the idea of the second study and show you the results relatively quickly. So in this study that I just showed you, participants could set their own reminders. And that's helpful from the policy perspective. If you want to understand what happens when you put a policy in place where people have to, this is what you can expect. But we may want to know, again, from a just out of a nerdy interest, we may want to know the deep parameters of remembering. What's the natural rate that would arise if people didn't use endogenous reminders? So that's what we're going to do in this study. And the trick is to encourage people to either use or not use reminders, and then instrument reminder use with encouragement and back out the implied remembering, what remembering would have without any reminder use. And so the idea here is to estimate these deep parameters behind prospective memory. So it's similar to the first study. I'm going to go a little quickly so we can finish all three studies. The difference is that we're going to tell people either to use a reminder to help them remember in the encouragement condition, or in the discouragement condition, we'll ask them, please don't use a reminder. And we'll follow up with them after the supposed contact date to ask them whether they really did or didn't use a reminder. There's a concern which arises in the setup, which is that people might tell us that they did or didn't use reminders just to please us, right? We ask them, please don't use reminders. Then we call them and say, hey, did you use a reminder? They have reason to say, yes, I was a good participant. I didn't use a reminder. So we'll try to control for that, and I'll tell you how. Let me briefly describe how we back out this natural rate of remembering. So the key idea is to instrument reminder use with encouragement assignment. Normally, you would do that in order to estimate the effect of reminders, right? So the endogenous variable is whether you use a reminder. The instrument is the encouragement treatment. We told you not to use a reminder or to use it, and the outcome variable is remembering. Normally, that you would use that kind of setup to estimate the slope, so to estimate what's the effect of reminders. But what we want to do is we want to estimate what would happen without the use of reminders. And so the idea is to use the constant term for that. So the first stage is encouragement, reminder use regressed on encouragement. The second stage is remembering regressed on predicted reminder use. And the argument is that the natural rate of remembering, we can read off the constant term in this IV regression. And that works, except we need one additional assumption, which is that the always takers have the same slope as the compliers. So let me illustrate this. We need a standard notifier assumption. And then the next thing to note is that the people who use reminders in the discouragement condition are the always takers, because in the discouragement condition, the never takers don't use reminders because they never use. The compliers don't use reminders precisely because they're compliers and you've discouraged them. But the reminders always do what you tell them. The compliers always do what you tell them to do. You've discouraged them, so they don't use reminders. So the only people who use reminders in the discouragement condition are the always takers. We've assumed away the defiers. We want to know what would happen if they didn't use reminders, but we don't observe their treatment effect. We will never know, because they're always takers, what they would do if they didn't use reminders. And so we can either assume that they have the same treatment effect as the compliers. So the slope of the always takers is the same as the slope of the compliers, or we can bound. So we can assume that without the reminders, the always takers always remember or always forget. Yes? I see. So they don't set a reminder, but I'll repeat the question. The question is whether it's possible that in the discouragement condition, the discouraged people pay more attention to the task. Yeah, I don't think I can rule that out. To reminders. So we'll know whether they set a reminder, and they mostly don't. So I think you're thinking of defying, right? You're thinking that in the discouragement condition, you've now made them aware that reminders might be effective, so they're particularly interested. So two answers to that. One is we see very little reminder use in the discouragement condition, as we're hoping. Two, as in all IV settings, we assume away defiers. So we can't rule out that the few people who do use reminders are defiers, but that's the problem that any RCT has. But you'll see that the share is very, very low. It's in the single digits. Great question. Okay, so here's how this works graphically. On the x-axis, I'm showing you the share of people using reminders. This is an example of the 1,000 shilling reward, but it looks similar for the other two rewards. The discouragement condition leads to 2% reminder usage, partly in answer to your question, so we don't worry that much about whether these people are defiers or not. In the encouragement condition, 77% of people use reminders, and then we can ask what share remember in the two conditions. And here it's 73% in the discouragement and 82% in the encouragement condition. And note that you can read the slope estimate. The slope estimate tells you the IV coefficient, right? So slope is rise over run. Rise is the first stage, rise is the reduced form, the effective encouragement on remembering. Run is the first stage, the effective encouragement on reminder use. So the slope here is the IV estimate, but that also means that the intersect with the y-axis is the natural rate of remembering. Under this assumption that the slope for the, we can extrapolate out the slope, right? So strictly speaking, this slope we can't be sure about, but it really helps that it's only 2% here. We don't have a lot of space to go wrong. The other thing we can do, like I mentioned, is to bound. So we can assume that these 2% either all remembered, would have remembered, or would have forgotten. And I use both approaches. So these are the results for the 3 different monetary rewards. The rate of remembering is now the natural rate, and the colored lines are the point estimates. So that's extrapolating out, assuming that the IV coefficient is the same as the always takers coefficient. And the dotted lines are the bounded estimates. And you see that it doesn't move around very much with the bounding, precisely because the share of reminder use in the discouragement condition is so low. Yeah. I can repeat it. Yeah. No, it's lower. I'll show you that now. It's lower. Yeah, as you would expect. So if you think that endogenous reminder use in the first study helped people at least a little, then you would think that these curves are lower than in the first study, and that's the case. So the IV estimate here of the natural rate in the second study, 13 percentage points lower than the estimate with endogenous reminders in the first study. And when you use the bounds, it's between 12 and 16 percentage points lower. So yes, endogenous reminder use in the first study did bias our estimates upward. And so what people would do if they were left to their own devices, then this is the way to test it, and you end up with lower rates of remembering. And it's a great question because it wasn't guaranteed to come out this way, right? Like there's no mechanical way in which this had to happen. And when you fit a function, I'm not going to show you these results, but again, the power function is the best fitting function to describe this natural rate of remembering. Okay, I think I'm out of time if I'm understanding correct. Yeah, 3 minutes. Okay, so let me just briefly show you the results of the third study, and then I can tell you about demand effects in the question. So the basic idea of the third study is to measure the subjective rate of remembering, and I do this simply by willingness to pay task. So I tell people, here's your task, you have to send us a reminder, you have to send us a message 3 weeks from now, and you can choose between whether we send you a reminder to help you remember that, and then your payoff is somewhat lower, or we don't send you a reminder, but then you get the full payoff. And by titrating how much people are willing to give up in order to get that reminder, we can estimate what their own perceived probability of remembering is with a couple of additional assumptions. So for example, we can use a linearity assumption. If people have linear utility, then their expected probability of if remembering is just the expected value of what the reminder, the willingness to pay implies. Let me know if you want the more detailed description of that. But basic idea is we can ask people their willingness to pay, and that allows us to estimate subjective probability. And these are the results. So these curves here are subjective probabilities as a function of amount and delay. And there's a couple of things to notice here. One is that they're quite flat, almost entirely insensitive to delay. The other is that they're much higher than, at least in some cases, than the actual probabilities of remembering. So just to remind you, these are the actual probabilities from study 1. And what we can do in order to make the contrast between these a little bit more salient, we can take each condition, so amount and delay, and we can plot the actual remembering probability against the subjective remembering probability across the two studies. And so you can see that if people were veridical in their perceived remembering probability, you would see a 45-degree line, right? The fact that it's much flatter than that suggests that their actual remembering probability is much less sensitive to delay than their true remembering probability, and the degree to which the subjective remembering probability is above the 45-degree line, that's the degree to which people are over-optimistic, right? So for a point over here, their actual remembering probability is quite low, whoops. Their subjective remembering probability is quite high. And so people are over-optimistic for most of the conditions, with some exceptions. So for short delays especially, so this is the shades here go from short delays to long delays in the dark colors. For the short delays especially, people are actually pessimistic. They underestimate their own ability to remember. And this is also true for some of the amounts. So on average, people overestimate their remembering probability by 7.5 percentage points. And that's more true for small amounts and long delays. So for small amounts, they overestimate themselves by 18 percentage points. For large amounts by only 3 percentage points. And for short delays, today and tomorrow, they underestimate by 5 percentage points. For long delays, they overestimate by 11 percentage points. So it's a more nuanced result than what we saw in the other studies that people have done previously. Yes, question? Yeah.
The figures that people are expecting that they will remember something, remember to contact you as well in tomorrow as in 5 weeks. Is that what the results
Roughly,
indicate?
yeah.
It seems a bit very counterintuitive. Because if you ask someone, are you going to remember something as well in 5 weeks as you will in 1 hour or maybe tomorrow? I'm sure most people would say, no, of course not.
Yeah.
So what is this? I mean, is this method actually captures my question?
So
You're saying subjective, right? So what they think, right?
yeah. So that's a hard one to answer. Maybe let me say one easy thing, which is that the slope is negative, even though it's very hard to see here. So for all intents and purposes, let's call that flat. I think maybe the question is this operationalization into willingness to pay the right way to ask this question? Would you get a different answer if you ask people, are you going to be better at remembering in tomorrow than in 5 weeks? Perhaps you'd get a different answer. I don't know. And yeah, that might be an interesting study to run. Like if you could get people to just give you a probability. People are not great at probabilities, so I considered that and dismissed it, because when you ask people to give you a number, they either give you 0 or 100%. But it could be that you'd get a different answer if you ask them for the direct comparison. Yeah.
The value of money change in 5 weeks. And the reason I'm asking this is the way to think is if I call now, that's where I do the job. But then if I'm at week 5, I get paid immediately. If I'm week 1, I gotta be paid later.
Yeah.
So this the green one, kind of this U-shaped type of relationship makes more sense to me, because initially, yeah, I remember I do it right away. But then closer it is to the payout date, more likely it is that I'll be willing to do the work, because there's opportunity cost of calling, right? I might be working in the field, and then when I make the call, stop.
Yeah.
So if I stop working, maybe, I don't know how big of a deal that is, but then I get paid immediately.
Yeah. That's a great question. So there's a couple of things to say. So I think the question is, how should we think about basically, I think the delay between when you do the task and when you get payment. In the beginning, that delay is very large. In the middle, it's also still somewhat large, and in the end, it's very short. And so you might be more motivated to do the task towards the very end when payment is more imminent than at the beginning. And so that's a great point, and one that so you're always in this pickle that you want to hold constant one of the values of the reward, right? One is, like the way that I've chosen to do it here is to hold constant the value from the time at which you decide whether you're going to do the task, which is in the very beginning. But as you were saying, that there's sort of an ongoing decision. You need to decide to do the task right at the moment when you need to do it. And so there's a couple of things to say. One is that the fact that the reminder condition has basically 100% success, and the task was purposefully very, very easy. We made it as simple as possible, also in contrast to some of these other studies. The Bronchetti study had people do it. Made it very easy for people to do the task precisely to avoid this kind of problem. And the fact that it works so well in the no reminders condition makes it less problematic. The other is that I haven't shown you another study that I did where the payment comes immediately after you do the task, and you get the exact same, well, very, very similar results. And so that's not great from the point of view of estimating the function, because now the value changes at the time where you're deciding, am I going to be part of the study or not? But it answers this problem. Yeah. Great point. Yeah. 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 So the question is, why does stake size matter? I've been struggling to write down a model for this, and I think not for this specifically, but generally for this study. I think the way that I would think about this in the model is that you expend for large amounts, you're more motivated, and so you expend more effort in encoding the task that you need to do. So that's one factor. And possibly a second factor is that the salience of a large reward is higher. So you can think of extreme examples where you would find it very easy to remember. So if I promise you very credibly that I'll pay you $5 million if you send me a text message next week, that would have a different salience to you, presumably, and you would find it easier to remember than if that was about a mug. So yeah, I've shown you 3 studies on prospective memory, a little over 3,000 participants. Find a very high rate of forgetting, especially for short delays and small amounts. It's well described by a power function, both in the first and the second study, and that's very similar to old results from the 1880s by Hermann Ebbinghaus for retrospective memory. It seems like endogenous reminder use plays some role. Without these reminders, people are less likely to remember. That's the second study. And the subjective probability of remembering is higher than the true probability, but that's only true for long delays and small amounts. It's not true for short delays and large amounts. So that's it, and I'm happy to take more questions.
Thank you very much for that very fascinating talk. I was wondering about the relationship between the shape of forgetting and what's at stake in your first study. So I would have thought that there's probably something like, I can keep X many things in my head at a time, and probably over the course of 1 or 2 days, not too many other things are going on that would be equivalent to 4 days my daily income. So I can keep your task in my head and maybe forget about something else that I otherwise would have remembered. And over the course of 5 weeks, it's more likely that your task isn't in the top 10 that I can keep in my head at a time, and this one falls off my radar. And if that were the case, it would depend a lot on what else is going on in my life, whether I remember your task or anything else I have to remember. Do you have any information that would give you some insight into how people vary in their ability to remember things, how stressed they are?
Yeah,
Who they are would affect that, I'm guessing?
that's a great question. I really like the sort of implied model that you outlined. So I think you're basically saying there's like a list of things ordered, let's order them by stake size in your head at any given time. And like that mechanically grows by the duration that you're considering. And so the mechanics of forgetting here are that as the window grows, the likelihood of there being other important tasks in that window grows. And so therefore, this one gets displaced by other important tasks, right? I think that's the model.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I don't think I have good correlates. So I think, yeah, you would measure something like how busy people are, how stressed people are, how much other stuff they have. Maybe even like including the stake size. And I don't have that. I can quickly show you the demographics if we still have the slides. Yeah, so this is the demographic correlates.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing obviously in here. I mean, maybe some things that would correlate with being busy, although it's not clear which direction actually. So yeah, that would be nice to have some sort of questionnaire of how stressed people are.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay, thanks. We don't have anything in the chat at the moment. I don't know. I can't see if there's more people raising their hands in the room.
There's someone in the room, so we can do that. Yeah. Right. Okay, that's a great question. So I think there's two questions. One is, what about habits? Like many of these actions you perform more than once. For vaccination, actually, I had in mind that at 1 year, which maybe is only once, but do you have other vaccinations that need to happen? And certainly water chlorination you're supposed to do every day. And the other is about non-monetary stakes. And so maybe a meta comment is that I'm hoping that this will open up the space for a lot more work in this area. There's many questions. Habits is obviously super central and very relevant. And so one of the things that you could easily imagine doing is asking people to perform a task repeatedly and asking at which point reminders push it into the habit domain where it then sort of runs on its own. So that would be a very involved but eminently feasible study. And then, yeah, for the non-monetary stuff, I think that's also very intuitive that would be really important. Harder for economists to think about because you can't put a monetary value on it as easily, but this is the data. So this is the convex budgets task. That's Andreoni and Sprenger standard convex time budgets task. And this is the present bias parameter beta. You can see that it's in the group of people who forget in that first study. It's lower than in the group of people who remember, and that difference is statistically significant. So I don't have a good model of what happens there other than present bias correlates with all sorts of undesirable outcomes, and forgetting now turns out to be an additional one. But here there isn't a clear link. So you can draw a clear link if you if this was a task where the monetary value wasn't held constant, the present value of the reward wasn't, then it would fall out mechanically from a present bias story, because then the future reward just isn't worth as much to you. You invest less effort now in remembering it, and you're going to be worse. That's easy. But that's not the case here. These rewards happen all at the same time. And so that's what makes it puzzling and probably puts it in the domain of some people have their act together and others don't.
Thank you very much for a fascinating seminar, Johannes. That was really great. And thanks, Juliana, for organizing. And yeah, I hope everyone can join me in thanking the speaker.